Hello, everybody, and welcome to Notes from the Front. I'm your host, Michelle Tandler. Today, we're talking about housing. It's the single biggest expense in most American households, and the more I've dug into policies around it, the more alarmed I've become. Our guest is Judge Glock, Director of Research at the Manhattan Institute. He's one of the sharpest, most pragmatic thinkers on this issue that I have found. We talk about zoning, rent control, the fires that destroyed tens of thousands of apartments in the 1970s Bronx, and what's coming next for New York City. I hope you find this episode interesting and informative. Here's Judge. All right, so if you were to stack rank the top three barriers to building more housing, what would the top three be?
So I should warn some of your more YIMBY-ish listeners, and I'm sure they're out there. And YIMBY, of course, stands for Yes in My Backyard, uh, which is a group of people started out of the Bay Area, actually, who worked in particular to limit zoning restrictions on new development. I have written, much to the chagrin of some of my allies in the YIMBY movement, a piece called Two Cheers for Zoning, which describes how zoning can, in the appropriate situation with appropriate guardrails, actually be a way to allocate where housing should go in a metropolitan region. We don't have to go into all the details of that. But if you put the gun to my head and ask me what is the number one issue with new housing development in America, it is zoning. It's those rules that are basically describing how dense a new development can be and what its use can be. A lot of places across America will make it impossible to build anything other than a single family house. And a lot of those places will make it impossible to build anything but one single family house for every, say, 3 or 5 or even more acres. If you're a developer and you buy, say, 100 acres, and you could build a whole effective city on that spot if you actually wanted to, and you actually had all the permits and permission and so forth. But a lot of cities say, no, according to our zoning rules, you're actually allowed to build, say, 20 houses on that. And as long as those rules are in place, it's going to be really, really hard to create the supply to meet the demand for housing and all of that. Now, so zoning is probably the first issue. But what I do sometimes remind people, and which I think is an important qualification of that statement, is that zoning is basically everywhere in America, but incredibly high housing prices are not. So the existence of zoning per se is not necessarily the issue. The issue is excessively strict zoning, the zoning that prevents any new development. St. Louis, Chicago, Columbus, Oklahoma City, Dallas, they all have zoning rules and pretty extensive zoning rules, just like San Francisco and LA do. But they have housing prices that are a third or less of the prices in San Francisco and LA. Now, why is that? That's been kind of one of my big mysteries that I've been noodling on for quite a while, which is, okay, we have these rules that we all agree are too strict in general, but why are these same rules really, really strict in San Francisco and not really strict in Dallas, or at least not strict enough to really stop housing? And my main answer, and it's not entirely satisfying, but I think it's part of it, is that you want local governments to have an incentive to grow. Governments care about incentives just like people do. Just like when I talk about developers care about profit, they're not in this for their health. A local government cares about how much money they can raise from new building. In America, local governments get money from new building through two ways. What are known impact fees in the first place. You build a new building, you have to pay, say, $20,000 to pay for all the public goods you use, the new roads, the sewers, the electric, etc. And then property taxes. You get property taxes. The city gets these property taxes when a new building gets put up. And my argument is that in places like Texas or Oklahoma City, there's a lot better connection between that new development and the fiscal benefits those local cities get than there is, say, in San Francisco or LA or some of the coastal cities where they've made a lot of these bad reforms to property taxes and other things that make it more difficult for cities to approve new housing and probably just more importantly, make it less worthwhile. I think what you want to do is make those cities and places that have those zoning rules say, hey, I want to build because I let that new development happen and the property taxes are going to go down for all the existing homeowners. The impact fees are going to pay for all of these other services we have to deliver, and it's great. And the last thing I'll say on this before I shut up is a lot of people say, no, it doesn't really matter, these property taxes and fiscal incentives and everything. But one, you have every city in America actually is usually really excited about commercial property. If they're building a new office building, if you're building a data center, they're actually usually really pumped to have you build that in their community. And there's not the same sort of vituperous opposition that you get from housing. Why is that? Well, I would say the main reason is they don't require much services and they give off a lot of free property taxes to the rest of the city. The biggest, kind of the second example, or specific example I give, do you know where the global epicenter of data centers is? Global, anywhere on Earth, where the place where we have more of these new AI data centers being built and where there's more existing data centers than anywhere else on Earth.
I feel like it's a random state on the East Coast.
You're right. You're right. It's.
Wait, I want to
Okay.
guess. I feel like it's going to be like Virginia or something.
It is, and it's
Oh.
Northern Virginia, and it's not even just Virginia. It's a place called Loudoun County, Virginia, which by some measures is the richest county in the country. Average median income about of $150,000 a year, and the sort of suburban place you'd think that would be perfectly opposed to any sort of new development, and yet it's the global epicenter of data centers because everyone in that county knows that data centers throw out tons of free tax money to them. Their schools are absolutely gorgeous. Their property taxes have been going down for 20 years. And yes, they have objections to some data centers, just like they have objections to some new housing. But do they get those barriers out of the way because they can benefit and see those, smaller class size and all the rest of it? Yes, they do. So anyway, that's all a very long-winded way of saying that zoning is a really, really big deal and probably the biggest deal, but it's everywhere. And what we should really look at is why certain areas are really, really strict on zoning and some areas are not. So.
Right. And just to make sure I understand that properly, why commercial is more popular than housing is, I guess it wouldn't impact the housing prices of existing residents by increasing supply. So they're happy to have commercial because it spits off tax revenue, but doesn't threaten the value of their home.
Yes, so two things, exactly. One, the new commercial development doesn't threaten the value of their home, as you point out. But I think even more importantly because 10 new housing units on the east side of your city is probably not going to materially affect your housing prices if you're living somewhere in that city, and yet you still see a lot of opposition. But the bigger issue is commercial property basically doesn't require any money for the city to service. When you build a new house, you need to educate the kids. You need a lot of police presence if the kids turn into teenagers, as they have a tendency to do, and you got to arrest them occasionally. You need the new sewer, water, all the other stuff. Housing new people takes a lot of money to service, and that comes out of the property tax dollars. Commercial property is basically nothing. You don't have the police showing up every other day at your local accountancy firm in an office building to make sure there's not fights between the two different groups of accountants. They don't cost anything. They're just free money for the city. And so in general, even in California, they tend to be very pro new commercial development because they know it throws off a lot of cash. Mm-hmm. It doesn't cost much.
Any other constraints to housing development that you want to discuss right now? I was also curious to get your thoughts on how things like rent regulation impact development of, multifamily housing, environmental review, like maybe getting back to those examples of why St. Louis and Dallas are having an easier time building housing than some other cities.
Yeah. And I should qualify, of course, places people will rightfully ramp like, well, St. Louis, that people don't want to live in St. Louis. The city's lost 70% of its population over the past 100 years. But some people do, and they're actually building to meet the demand and all of that. And even high demand places like Dallas and Oklahoma City are building fairly well. But first, on the environmental review issue. So also a lot of more YIMBY-ish groups object to this. But I think one of the biggest barriers to development is the inability to sprawl outwards. A lot of people in the pro-housing movement, of which I very much consider myself a part, think about density and how we can get more multifamily units in big cities. And that's a very important thing. And rent control is very crucial there, as we'll discuss in a second. But to my mind, most Americans still live in a single family house. And when you do polling, the vast majority of Americans want to live in a single family house, which means if you're going to solve housing cost pressures, you need to build more single-family house, which means building outwards. And right now, there's a ton of regulations, especially in those coastal states, that make it really hard to build outwards. I often cite the fact that about 40% of the 9-county Bay Area, anywhere from a third to 40%, depending on how you measure it, is pasture land. You have cows eating grass on land that's effectively worth $10 million an acre. That could be built up at Manhattan level densities if some developer was allowed to do that. Why? It's not even just zoning. Developers are prevented from building anything out there, basically because of a lot of environmental rules. They don't want them to mess up the beautiful pasture land or so forth. San Francisco and LA are, by some measures, the second and third densest cities in the country. It is good they are densifying and they're building more multifamily housing. But their main problem is not that they haven't densified, unlike other places. They've densified a lot. They could still do a lot more, but they've still grown pretty much upwards and much more so than other places, is that they can't grow out. And that's overwhelmingly those environmental rules. Should I do now? Then we can talk about growing up and rent control. Should I?
Yeah.
Go
Yeah,
on
sure.
that? Okay. Not to get us into a whole tertiary issue here, but when I used to be a professor, the other thing I would say is there's only two things all economists agree on, pretty much. It's that rent control is bad and tariffs are bad as well. Now, in the past 6 years, tariffs and rent control have been the two policies that have come back into force most magnificently, and that is, of course, a shame. Now, both economists on both of those fronts, and I'm not going to get into the tariff discussion, will say there's exceptions, of course, for national security or maybe rent control in a very particular acute emergency or something like that. We can talk about those exceptions. But in general, for rent control, people agree it is just a dumb way to reduce housing prices, specifically because, like I said before, the whole reason someone builds a new housing unit is because they expect to make money off it. If you limit the amount of money they can make on the new housing unit, they're not going to build it in the first place. And even more important than the building for rent control is the fact that any particular year, we're only adding about 1% to the housing stock. Most housing we're living in, of course, is many, many years, if not decades old. And the only reason that is maintained by people, by landlords in the case of renters, of course, is because they expect to regularly make money on the maintenance of that. But right now in New York and San Francisco and elsewhere, you have rent control so strict that it's making it impossible not only to make money off new housing development, but to even maintain the housing that's in existence right now. And what we're worried about, I'm very worried about, is we're going to go back to a situation like the 1970s, when you had large numbers of apartment buildings, most importantly in the Bronx, but across New York City and some other places across the country, that were burned down for insurance money. Because the money that the landlords could get from the rent controlled apartments was so infinitesimally minimal that it wasn't worthwhile for them to maintain it, and it was more worthwhile for them to burn down the housing and kick out any of the tenants who might have been there. And that's obviously the worst sort of thing that you can do if your goal is to make more affordable housing and more housing units available for everybody.
Yep. I want to just rewind on 2 points there. And I do
Okay.
want to get to the Bronx is burning concept. You said that rent control could hurt developers' ability to make money, but isn't most rent control specifically focused on old housing stock? So how would that impact developers?
So one, it usually is focused on old housing stock because even the proponents of rent control know this is a big red flag for developers. There are some examples of, I believe, St. Paul and Montgomery County recently who made rent control required for new developers. And what you saw was pretty straightforward. I think Montgomery County, I forget the exact lineaments of their rent control ordinance or how strict it was on new development. But since they put it in just 2 or 3 years ago, not a single new multifamily housing unit has gone up in the city. So there are those examples when it can directly impact new developers. Now, the other thing is that when local governments say, hey, developers, we're only doing rent control on older buildings, please trust us. Developers are rightfully wary because they know those governments are lying. Those governments have lied before, and most likely they will lie again. So New York City imposed famously tight rent control back in, I believe, 1947. And they said, oh, it was only for older buildings, and don't worry, new developers, you can come in and build whatever you want, and it won't affect you. And then in the 1970s, they put new rent control on again, this time called rent stabilization, but it's a different kind of rent control. Uh, and said, okay, this is only going to affect buildings built before 1974. Don't worry, new developers, this is not going to affect you. But a lot of developers then and afterwards said, wait a second, fool me twice, shame on me. This is, uh, you guys said you weren't going to do this again, and look what's happening. You're rent controlling new buildings, and people have often used the New York kind of example as kind of a one-off and kind of historical story because hey, we've had the rent control now from the 70s for 50 plus years and nothing's changed. But it was just 2 years ago, and the Good Cause Tenancy Protection Act or whatever the exact name in New York was, that they put effective new rent control on buildings built before 2009 in New York City. It's a higher rate than the rent stabilization, but it is a rent control law. And so now you've had the third time where New York City has said, hey, listen, we're only doing it on historical properties. Don't worry about it. Again, developers are rightfully looking at that and saying, no, I'm not going to trust you guys anymore.
Right.
And I'm not going to build. And we've seen it time and time again. When the cities impose new rent control, even on older buildings, development falls off a cliff.
Right. Because they can build elsewhere. They're a developer. They can pick a
Yeah,
different state to
anywhere in
build
the
in.
country. That money can go anywhere you want. Forget even the developer themselves, which you can just think of as someone who's located in a particular county or city. The money that someone invests in that developer can go anywhere else in the country. It can go into a government bond. It can go into a Jamba Juice or wherever else. And if that developer is not going to make money in New York City, that developer dollar is going to fly elsewhere, which it most certainly has.
Right. Um, Can you just rewind and explain the difference between rent control and rent stabilization? Just for that comes up a lot. People will say, no, there isn't rent control in New York City. It's rent stabilization. Could you explain the difference? And then also, can you explain a little more about what happened in the 1970s in terms of the housing stock and what was going on and why it led to a lot of buildings being set on fire? I'd also be just curious to hear your sense of like, how big of a problem was that really? Was it an occasional, a few buildings here and there, or was this a real problem?
Uh, so on the second question, on the extent of the fires, they were really real. It is very hard to know how many of those fires were landlord precipitated. So we know there was a massive waves of fires throughout the Bronx and New York City in the 1970s. I'm looking at a book on my bookshelf right now called The Fires, looking at that examined the wave of arson across at New York City at the time and America more broadly. And some of that was just the inevitable result of ill-maintained buildings. So rent control can make the building very rickety, less likely to have the landlords repair the sprinkler system, less likely for them to, say, put up locks to prevent vagrants or other people from going into the buildings. So we know a lot of this was also just happening from drug addicts and temporary residents who were setting up shop in dilapidated buildings and lighting fires to stay warm and then burning the building down. So in one sense, one could say that is still rent control being the culprit there, even if it wasn't directly the landlords. So
By the
there's
way,
two things.
I'll pause you for just
Yeah.
1 second. I asked ChatGPT. In my mind, it was like a few dozen fires. I know there was a famous one where the World Series was being filmed and
Yeah.
the broadcaster said something like, "The Bronx is burning," and it
Yeah.
became this famous line. I just asked ChatGPT how many buildings burned in the Bronx in the 1970s. This is an astounding answer. It says, short answer, tens of thousands of buildings were damaged or destroyed, but the exact number depends on how you count. It says between 1970 and 1980, the Bronx lost roughly 30 to 40% of its housing stock. Estimates suggest 40,000 to 60,000 housing units were destroyed. In the South Bronx, some neighborhoods lost over 60% of their buildings. And New York City was seeing 30,000 structural fires per year citywide in the mid 1970s, with a huge concentration in the Bronx. And it basically said a single apartment building fire could destroy dozens of units. Um, that's just wild. They said by
It is what,
1980,
yeah.
parts of
So
the
there was
Bronx
the
looked like a
famous.
war zone.
It did, and there was a book from 1980 about rent control that famously had a bunch of pictures of European cities that were bombed out after World War II and pictures of American cities under rent control, and you had to guess which was which. Like, and it was hard. It's harder than you think. You're like, okay, that kind of rubble looks like it's a bombing. That kind of rubble looks like it's a rent-controlled, arson-destructed building. Uh, there is the famous economist Assar Lindbeck who said, rent control appears to be the most effective way to destroy a city, except for bombing. And I've often cited that famous quote. But then I read a quote from a Vietnamese official after the Vietnam War who said, "Oh, we imposed rent control in Hanoi, and that actually did much more damage than any of the American bombs ever did." So it might actually be worse. The old line that rent control is the best way to destroy a building except for bombing. Depending on how bad the rent control is, it can actually apparently blow up cities a little more. Um, so, yeah, how common was the landlord side of it? As I mentioned before, a lot of this is just ill maintenance, the bad effects of rent control leading to dilapidated buildings. The other side of this is we do know there was a tendency for buildings to burn from the top. And the old assumption was that if a fire starts at the very top of the building, that was likely a landlord because it gave all the residents the time to escape from the building before it came down. And the
Wow.
other thing we know is that the federal government did exacerbate this. They had this FAIR plan, fair adjusted insurance regulation or something, where the federal government was worried about dilapidated buildings not getting insurance in New York and elsewhere. So they actually created this special building insurance plan for very rundown buildings. And in classic federal government fashion, this thing that was supposed to prevent the dilapidation of buildings led to a lot more insurance claims and fires because it made it so much more valuable than a typical private insurance company would do to burn down the building. And so that's one of the other reasons we know that arson probably, including on the part of some landlords, played a part in these buildings going down due to rent control.
Fascinating. Okay, I'll, by the way, include links to these articles and books that you're mentioning in the show notes when I
Okay.
post this. Okay, so it sounds like I think that's a good explanation of constraints. So we had zoning, environmental review, hurting sprawl, and rent control, basically creating, I don't want to use the word vibe, but maybe culture of developers being wary of government and how they're going to get involved or not with housing prices.
And just to be clear too, some of the new rent control that's happened in the past 6, 7 years is very explicitly one statewide and two on basically all rental buildings. So even in the depths of the 1940s or 1970s rent control periods, most of the regulation was on older buildings like you described. And it was usually citywide. But Oregon was the first state in America to ever have statewide rent control, and that only happened in 2019. And then California followed up soon afterwards. And I said New York effectively did this a few years later. But these had rent control that said, hey, you can only raise your rent 5% a year plus inflation to a maximum of, say, 10% a year, which everybody, when they passed it, said, hey, that's an incredible number. Nobody has to worry about landlords raising their rents that much in a year. It's just an outer limit to kind of establish a ceiling on this problem. But those were passed right before the big inflation of 2021 and onwards, and right before the incredible housing and rent price spiral. So that stuff became very serious very quickly, and that's a real problem. And then maybe I can mention just very briefly the rent control and stabilization difference that
Exactly.
we never.
Perfect segue. And let's dig into New York a bit
Yeah.
because that
So
has
though.
has been very much in the news recently. Big change in government in New York. We now have a
Yeah.
Democratic socialist as mayor. He's building a team of people who are saying things like, everyone should live in public housing. Yeah, let's dig in.
Yeah. So yeah, the original 19 again, I believe 1947 New York City rent control was very strict in that your rent was frozen at the dollar amount that it was in 1947 or whenever you rented it. And the landlord could not raise that effectively more than a few dollars, depending on maintenance and some other stuff. So I still think you have New Yorkers, and maybe you can correct me on this if you know this, who have been living in the same unit for 70 years now, and are paying $100 a month rent. I had a friend who I think had the building passed down from their grandmother or something, and you could have, if your relative lived there and you lived there at first while they were still alive, and then your relative died, you could pass on the rent control. So you have these just absolutely absurd cases of people living in New York City apartments, pre-war apartments, for a few $100 a month. And that's the old rent control, which is very bad. The new rent stabilization that was passed in the 1970s gave this rent guidelines board the authority to raise rents on these newer built buildings a few percent a year, depending on what they felt was necessary for inflation and costs and so forth. So, not surprisingly, though, you've had now decades of New York politicians promising not to raise rent, and they've done it by keeping the rents on these older buildings down. And that's been very hard for those rent stabilized, as it's known, landlords for building the post 1947 buildings. But you haven't had someone like Mondami who's come in who said, I'm going to permanently freeze the rents on these buildings, and they're not going to go up for at least years and years. I say permanently as long as he can. And that will be devastating because the New York City's own rent guidelines board, the people that supervise the rents and decide how much to raise them, and will have to decide how to raise them under Mondami, admit that about 10% of rent stabilized buildings can't afford basic maintenance or operations. That means they're in burn down territory already before Mondami comes in and freezes rents. So that's going to be a very dangerous situation we're in. I'm not saying it's necessarily going to be the Bronx back in the 70s or anything like that, but we're already pushing a situation where the landlord says, I would rather just throw the keys in the river than keep this building operation because I'm losing dollars every single day. And we already saw some of the first big bankruptcies that are going on. And because of this, and as you well know, Mondami's big housing advisor, Cia Weaver, said, well, one of the advantages of this is we can push these buildings into public ownership because they'll be bankrupt, and then we'll manage them. But, we don't have to go into the long, sordid, and depressing history of public housing in America to know that's a bad idea. Beyond all the burned down building in the Bronx, we have piles of rubble littering American cities across the continent because those public housing units built in the 50s, 60s, and onwards were so ill maintained and become such unbelievable cesspools of crime and violence that we had to blow them up. And I do hope that Weaver and Mondami and others are not longing to go back to that very unfortunate era where we were trying to shove more and more poor people into public housing.
Right. I think it's estimated that NYCHA, New York City Housing Authority, that's the public housing in New York, has 170,000 open, outstanding work orders involving issues like leaking roofs, mold, pests, broken pipes. Like, these are not small. This is not like come fix my window shade.
And yeah, and
So,
it's really bad, and like especially bad for New Yorkers. And you saw this occasionally, like during Hurricane Sandy. A lot of these apartment buildings are high rises, and if the elevator goes out, life is effectively over. Especially for these elderly residents. You have an
right.
elderly
They get
resident
stuck.
on a tenth floor. The elevator goes out. Well, you now effectively are a prisoner in your house, and it's just the simple reason that always baffled me a little bit about the public housing movement was what's the logic about why the government would be a good landlord? Like, there's plenty of things government needs to do. They need to build roads, do police, all the rest of it. Why do you think the government has comparative advantage in maintaining buildings? They don't. They're terrible at it. You imagine imagine if every building in America was maintained by a bunch of people appointed by politicians who are hired under a strict civil service system where impossible to remove them, and they had no incentive to serve their residents because the units were going to be filled no matter what because they were basically free. How do you think that'd turn out? Well, it turned out like it did across America when they had to eventually blow up Prout, Ego, and St. Louis, and Cabrini Green, and Chicago, and all these other public housing units. So the idea they want to push more and more units into public ownership is just frightening to me.
Yeah, from a financial perspective, it's also very concerning because already New York City Housing Authority has a backlog of $80 billion worth of changes. So that goes beyond someone, bringing up a request about their floors or, their specific faucet. That's also building maintenance. So things like structural things like roofs or water heaters or, foundations, like
Yeah.
the common structures that I think people often don't think about when they think about just an individual unit. They don't realize how many of those units all rely on a lot of costs that are spread across all the units. So the elevator,
And
everyone shares.
yeah, all the things that we've all heard about why government is bad at maintaining roads and infrastructure and all the rest of it, that applies doubly to housing. All those incentives that government officials have to say cut a new ribbon and open up a new road, but not maintain the road, are there in spades with public housing. It's really nice to look like, hey, Mondami and Weaver gave you a new public housing unit and are keeping rents. Is the press or anybody else keeping close tabs on the fact that they defer maintenance after that for 15 years? No, of course not. But that's exactly what government tends to do when it manages these sorts of things. And that just leads to more costs over the long run. And again, these blown up public housing units.
Okay, so let's talk about incentives around rent control. I mean, if all economists think that it's a bad policy, and if I think those of us who have really studied it, understand the costs, things like, reduced development, reduced supply of housing, leading to more expensive free market units. I mean, New York City is famous for this. I think the average rental in Manhattan right now is $5,600. A lot of that is because 40% of the housing stock in Manhattan is rent, controlled or stabilized. Can you just share for the listeners what are the strongest arguments for rent control? Like who benefits from rent control? Why is there so much why is there so much positive regard for rent control? I
Mhm.
mean, that's what's been fascinating for me as I've started learning about this issue is it's almost it's almost like politically incorrect to critique rent control. It's, people say things like, if you don't have rent control, people are going to be thrown into the streets. Meanwhile, I've been talking to landlords who are saying things like every single one of my rent control tenants is a homeowner outside of New York City. Can you talk a little bit about the winners and losers in rent control and why it's such a popular policy?
Yeah, so I did a piece for the Free Press on this a while back, looking at, okay, exactly to your question. If it's so bad, and we all know it's bad, and the effects are so devastating, especially over the long run, why do we keep seeing it? Why don't we learn, in effect? And my overall answer was that the nature of the housing market is very peculiar and allows people to believe that rent control is not as damaging or price controls, one could say, are not as damaging in this sphere as they would be elsewhere. Because a lot of people say, well, of course rent control is popular. People like low prices. But politicians, including Mondami, don't say, well, I'm going to cap the price of food at $4 a meal or something like that. They just don't in America. There's occasionally times in wars and elsewhere where we have these general price controls, but you don't have your average urban politician saying, I'm not going to allow you to spend more than $1 a gallon on gasoline and $2 on food and all the rest of it. Why? Because if you put the price of the gasoline or the food too low, that gasoline or chicken nugget is going to fly right out of your city faster than you can chase it. Uh, if someone can't make money selling the chicken nugget, it's going to be sold in Jersey City or somewhere else. Housing, because it's immobile, because it literally can't run away, it's easier to have a price control on it without worried about driving the actual investment, the actual product outside of it. So that's one reason people think, hey, rent control can work. The building's right there, not thinking that, hey, there's all these maintenance costs. The building isn't a fixed thing that just exists in eternity. It is a thing that requires very regular upkeep and maintenance and oversight and all the rest of it. But it looks and is to some extent more than other products fairly immobile. Um, the other thing is that new housing is slow to build. I mentioned before that's only about 1% of the housing stock is every year gets built. So that means 99% of the housing stock is already there. So let's say you put really stringent rent control on and you prevent any new buildings being built, like say in Montgomery County, which I mentioned. Well, 99% of the supply is still there. It's steady. Again, that can decay over time if maintenance and other things don't catch up, but it's not moving in the short term. So you can have this really tight price control or rent control on these buildings, and still see the units there, and the effect on new development looks minimal. You start looking 25 years, and now all of a sudden, hey, 25% of the housing that was supposed to be there is not there, and that's a crisis. But in the short term, it doesn't look so bad. And then finally, as I pointed out in that piece, the fact that new supply, which is the only real way to drive down prices, is so slow to respond, means that there is no easy and quick solution to high housing prices that politicians could point to. And we're facing this at the federal level right now, where Trump and the Congress are both looking at different measures to reduce housing prices. But one, not only do they have to face the issue of most housing regulation issues are state and local, but two, anything they do is not going to have an effect over a median term, certainly during the term of their before their next election. And so when everybody's rightfully screaming about how high housing prices, like they are right now, and a politician comes along and says, well, I deregulated the housing market, and if you just wait 15 years, you're really, really going to see a big difference in housing prices. That's not the most satisfying answer on earth. Now, there are times when the rent regulation is so bad that it can even increase prices in the immediate term. You saw this when Javier Milei down in Argentina deregulated rents, and immediately prices went down. The rent controls were so bad.
Significantly down, right?
Yes,
wasn't it like 30 or 40% down in a year?
Yeah, and the price, which is like when you think about it, is astounding that you had a floor on rent that was actually keeping prices higher than it would be otherwise. Everyone points out, yeah, like, of course that the deregulation of the rent control worked really well, but not just the fact that you had more sales and more renters. Prices went down because people could actually start renting stuff out again and bringing it onto the market. And so there are times like that when the rent control is just so atrocious that it drives prices down or drives prices up in general, and you can remove it and reduce them. I mean, the last thing I'll say on the rent control that does have kind of an immediate effect on prices if you remove it. Rent control makes people not leave their house for the very good reason that you leave, you lose the benefits of rent control. So you have a lot of people sitting on housing units kind of indefinitely because they don't want to lose that $200 a month or $1,500 a month apartment unit. But the problem is that is another kind of supply. When people think, oh, 99% of the housing is still there. Well, okay, but if nobody leaves that housing and opens it up to rent someone else, there's no supply on the market. So right now, the fact that New York has both a very low vacancy rate of buildings that are open that people can rent, but it just has an unbelievably low turnover rate. People do not move in New York or rent-controlled cities like they do elsewhere, which means your average amount of apartments that you can see on an apartment list is really low, which, again, it's the buildings are physically there, but the supply in terms of what people can actually rent is not there because of rent control. So if you do remove that, you can create in the short term. But
right. I think also one of the critiques is that it leads to hoarding. So you might have an example where a family got a rent control unit, let's say a 3-bedroom, but the kids are grown up and have long ago left, but the couple stays there, or the widow or widower stays there forever in a 3-bedroom when maybe they would be happy to switch to a 1-bedroom, but because all the costs are so high and they have this incredibly low priced apartment, it's not even logical to leave.
Well, it can affect every aspect of someone's life. If you think about it. So people think about the hoarding, like the older family that has a big apartment and doesn't want to leave it. But it can. I mean, I've talked to people in New York and San Francisco that are debating not having kids or not having any more kids because they would have to leave their rent-controlled apartment if they did it. I know people that are thinking about not getting married or moving in together because they have a rent-controlled apartment. There is stuff that people's entire courses of their lives are shaped because the benefits of rent control are so massive that they're changing their preferences on marriage, children, cities, etc. on it based on this absurdly low rent they get on some of this stuff. So yeah, there's all these ways that people are effectively frozen into this portion of their life of when they got the unit and can't get out of it, which one is of course bad for the rental market, but two, it's just bad for the society. I actually moved into a DC rent-controlled apartment in like rent stabilized. It was similar in the 1980s, and I had moved in there after a guy who'd been living there for 50 plus years, and he was single and alone, and he died in the apartment. And I think it's not a coincidence that he spent his entire life in this tiny little apartment that was appropriate for a 28-year-old kid like me or whatever, partially because like he would have been insane to leave that. Why go on with your life course if you can live in a $400 a month rent apartment forever? So the hoarding
Right.
works on all sides of it.
Golden handcuffs. Yeah,
Yeah.
I've heard some pretty wild stories recently. I mean, if the buildings are not being maintained, they can have health impacts on people. People cling to these units. A lot of them have mold. People get
I mentioned
sick.
in one, yeah, I mentioned one of my free press pieces that Mondami made a big deal during the campaign about how many rats there were in New York City apartments, and they have a big problem with rats, of course, in New York City. But he didn't mention that the number of rats was twice as high in the rent-controlled apartments, in the rent-stabilized apartments, as in the market-rate apartments. So if you wanted to get rid of rats, hey, you had a solution. The problem was the solution was the opposite of what Mondami was preaching, which was to allow actually enough money to maintain these apartments and get rid of the rats that were biting people and children and all the rest of it.
Right. Just to explore the like the critique of what you're saying. I mean, people talk about rent control and say things like it keeps communities together, it keeps neighborhoods together. You want to have older people. You want to have a mix of incomes, like it protects diversity. Are there any arguments? I mean, so you're focused more on the financial side of things, like what
Yep.
will lead to more housing creation and prices coming down overall. And I think that that impacts many people, newcomers to a city, children who grow up in a city and want to stay and be able to rent a place, immigrants being able to move into a city. If you have the whole city locked up in rent control, for example, for a thought experiment, let's say the whole city is rent controlled, like no one's leaving, no one's coming, like can you just speak to what are the benefits, in your opinion, from a societal side that actually do like what are the let's say we're to get rid of rent control completely. What do you think would be the negative impact of that from a societal perspective? Like what are the arguments against you that you most respect?
Well, in the law, there's a certain term when people have rights that can be removed by changes in the law or changes in judicial decision, and that term is reliance interest. The basic idea is that whatever the system the government sets up at a particular moment in time, it may be fair, it may be unfair, but over time, people adjust their life, their expectations, their investments, everything to accommodate this government system. And to some extent, one could say it is unfair to promise people, an extent, a certain gift, a handout, whatever it is, and then take it away from them. They organize their life around this. You could say this with, say, Social Security on something or something. Maybe Social Security is too high, maybe it's too low, whatever it is. But people have organized their life around the expectation they get Social Security. And even if you're a pretty strong free marketer like me, I would have real concerns about, say, just destroying Social Security all of a sudden, because a lot of people are plan their whole life and rely on that. So I think there's an argument to be made that changes sometimes have to happen slowly, and you have to accommodate the fact that people's lives have been based on this. Again, sometimes you just need an explosion, which Javier Milei or something did in Argentina and Buenos Aires. But sometimes there's these reliance interests that made the city like they are today, and you need to adjust slowly. Now, on the question of like diversity of communities and neighborhoods and all of that, there's an old famous line, I forget who said it, that if you want things to stay the same, things are going to have to change, which means like in a lot of cases there's no way to mandate that a city stay the same. And we've seen this time and time again. You've seen places like, oh, let's protect, say, the West Village or whatever it is with a historical designation and make it impossible to change the housing uh, uh, mix in that city, because in that area, because we want it to stay the same.
So, yeah, as I was mentioning, one of the strongest arguments is merely that people have come to rely on it, and therefore it would be unjust in some sense to withdraw that thing they are relying on very suddenly. But that's certainly an argument about how to change the existing rent control system, not about whether or not we should extend it. That certainly wouldn't go to the question of sort of freezing rents permanently in the future or making new buildings subject to rent control. On the other question of whether or not rent control can help maintain communities, There's a semi-famous line about some politician, I forget who said, if you want things to stay the same, things are going to have to change. Meaning, if you want something to stay stable, you actually need to have a certain amount of change for that to happen. If you have rent control that freezes a community in place, that basically turns what was a community of, say, young families into a bunch of elderly citizens holding on to their rent control units, well, that community has changed pretty significantly. If you have a community, say, in the West Village that, say, was subject to historic preservation and you can't build any new units, some people say, well, that helps maintain the character of the community. Well, what that actually means is the cost of those units goes way up because there's not enough supply, and you turn what may be a working class community into a very wealthy community. You can't freeze a city in amber. This is the mistake a lot of people make. Think like, hey, we like how things are now, so we can just stop it. We like what the rents are. We like what the community looks like. But you can't do that. There's going to be natural turnover. There's going to be aging. There's going to be change in demand. And if you want a city to change or to stay the same, in some sense, have a mix of young families, of working class and middle class people, and if you want people to change their apartments and do things and be able to live in a community, well, you would need to allow the market to work. Using rent control and other devices to freeze the city in place is actually going to lead to a lot of huge changes that I think advocates of stable communities wouldn't like.
Okay, so who gets hurt the most from rent control? Like when let's look at New York, for example, 1 million units, right, are controlled or stabilized, whatever you want to call it, price controlled. And so that's about 40% of the stock. So those, units have very little turnover. Who is hurt from this? Like, what are the most negative impacts? And maybe if you could stack rank them to sort of the biggest problems that you see and down.
Well, I would say the people hurt the most are those in those borderline units that can't be maintained because of rent control. That's the people who actually wouldn't have mind maybe paying a few extra bucks a month rent as long as they could stay in the same apartment and raise their family, but who are fighting off rats and are worried about fires and are having broken windows and devices that their landlord will never fix because it's not worthwhile for them. Those are the people that are really hurt. Those families that are in need and kind of trapped in a rent-controlled building. Now, the next group that was most hurt is people who aren't in the city yet, or maybe who could never live in the city because of rent control. It's all the people who want to buy a house or who want to move into a Manhattan or Brooklyn apartment, but can't because no one is leaving those old Brooklyn apartments because of rent control, and nobody's building new ones because of rent control. Those groups that really are kind of outside the current mix, they don't get a vote when someone like Mondami imposes rent
Right.
control.
They're not voters.
They're not voters yet because they haven't lived there yet. They're potential voters.
They can't live in New York.
But they can't. They're driven out. There is some argument that Mondami can change the makeup of his own electorate by imposing things like rent control. You keep out maybe a new group of higher earning families or others who wouldn't vote for you, but they don't have rent control. There's an economist who described what he called the Curley effect, which was a famous Boston Irish politician who basically said, I don't want you WASPs and other non-Irish types in Boston. You guys can leave, and tried to make it kind of uncomfortable with them. And obviously, not only was that good for his constituents who are there, it other constituents out of the city that might have voted against him. And so you could say Mondami and some of these others who are they're actually keeping out people who might vote against them, which is a very unfortunate incentive for them to have.
Right. So the young, immigrants, right?
Immigrants,
People that come to
anybody who wants
US,
to move, anybody who wants to move into a
find
new
a place to
city,
live.
anyone who's looking to change their life, anyone who's looking to move into one of these exciting cities that's had high demand and is in response to that demand is unfortunately imposing rent control. Those are the invisible people that get hurt. They're never showing up on the rent rolls. They can't interview them. It's someone who's maybe stuck in Kansas City who had a dream of moving to New York their whole life and can't because there isn't an available apartment there for them. It's a very sad fact, but it very much affects that person who never, ever came in contact with Mondami or anyone else.
Right. I'd argue also it hurts families because families have changing housing needs over time as they add children to their family. And so people that with so little turnover and so little vacancy, I think the vacancy rate in New York is about 1.4%. I think it's the lowest in the whole country. It's hard for families to stay in the city because there's so little inventory and the prices are so high. So a lot of them end up leaving. That's the part that kind of irks me the most, just the inefficiency to think of, like I look out on the skyline of New York and I see all these, it's winter and I see just like hundreds of thousands of dark apartments at 7 p.m. And obviously tons of people are out to dinner and whatnot. But, when you talk to a landlord and they say something like, oh yeah, all my rent stabilized tenants are off in Boca in their condos for the winter. And meanwhile, there's like my friends are saying like, yeah, tons of our rent stabilized neighbors are out of town for the winter or, they're upstate in the summer and we want to have a baby and we can't afford a 2 bedroom. So we're
Yeah.
going to leave. And
And
I guess, then you just have to ask the question of like, who do you want to have the city protect and who do you not want to have the city protect?
it's one of the tragedies here. I think you're totally right. It freezes people in place or drives them out of the city entirely. So you have a situation where a lot of people, we all know the life course that happens. A lot of us, we move into a big city when we're just out of college, when we're young, we're looking for something. But then if we're stuck in a rent control apartment, if we don't have a vacancy, we either have to kind of get stuck in that place where we're just sitting in a 1 bedroom or a studio apartment forever, or we have to leave. They're not allowing people to chart their entire life course in a city. They're saying, hey, you're getting frozen in place kind of indefinitely there. And if you're looking at why families have been driven out of cities, and that's one of the big movements over the past 15 years, you've seen an incredible exodus of families from cities. That's got to be one of the big reasons they're not being allowed to purchase apartments appropriate for their needs in the cities right now.
Right. I mean, I'd also say a lot of the landlords that own huge swaths of rent stabilized stock. And what I find so fascinating is there's some sort of cultural thing about landlords. I think the word landlord doesn't help, but anytime you speak like, on Twitter or something about landlords, people are like, oh, boo hoo, landlords hurting. Like, who cares? They're just greedy. They're horrible. They're slumlords. But then you talk to some of these landlords, and like a lot of them are really nervous. They're going to go out of business. They are like barely breaking even on a lot of these buildings. And I don't think people think ahead to what does this mean? Like the thing that I'm concerned about, and I'd love your opinion on is, so you mentioned 10% of housing stock is underwater, meaning the cost to maintain it is higher than the rent that they can receive. So right now, what that's leading to is a lot of people just padlocking apartments in New York City and they're calling them ghost apartments, which I think is actually the perfect name because it's sort of like they're dead, right? But the ghost is still around. And it is sort
Yeah.
of haunting New York City.
Yeah.
I mean, you think like I'm talking to some of my friends, these ones who want to have babies, want a second bedroom. They're like 50,000 units are just sitting there padlocked. I could move into one of these, but I can't. And then the question is, how much does that go up and up and up? Does it go to 100,000, 200,000? At what point do you say, oh my gosh, we have a problem? The other problem associated with this is a lot of these, and actually what was fascinating, the whole Sia Weaver expose that occurred over the past couple of weeks, she's the lieutenant director for Mamdani. She's very explicit in all these podcast interviews that she's been on over the past few years, where she's basically saying, we want to drive down the value of these buildings. Like we want to use rent control as a weapon or as a tool to drive down the value of the buildings and like eventually have the city take over the housing. What she is failing to recognize though is actually when these landlords, when their buildings plummet in value, it isn't the city who's buying it. The city doesn't have money to buy all these like billions of dollars worth of like decrepit housing. The city has a $78 billion backlog of its own niche portfolio that needs fixes. So they don't have the capital to buy it. So what actually is happening is these enormous housing developer companies or housing management companies are buying in these fire sales, the portfolios of the local landlords. And so then, of course, there's this reaction like, oh, we can't have big corporate America owning rental units, but that's exactly what's happening. And so I was wondering if you could talk about, let's say this continues. Let's say the new administration in New York City cranks up tenant protections. A lot of landlords are going out of business. There's a lot of bankruptcies. Big companies are coming in to buy the portfolios of the bankrupt buildings. What are the either positive or negative downstream consequences of that scenario? Like,
Yeah.
is it a positive thing for big companies to come in and buy portfolios of dying housing or
I would
decaying
say,
housing?
yeah, I would say it could be depending on the circumstances, but the circumstances that lead to that uh, influx of outside investment capital could be very bad. And that seems to be what's happening here. So, yeah, everyone has this picture in their mind of landlords as this distant, ominous force that's extracting well earned money from actual productive citizens. And obviously, that's wrong on a bunch of levels. Landlording is a very difficult business, as anybody who is participating in it can tell you. We at City Journal at Manhattan Institute actually had a great series of articles, like Confessions of a Slumlord, about just hey, how much work it is to maintain buildings in poor parts of town. It's really really hard, and he gave you a real view of like just the pure shoe leather work you have to do to make sure those things are still working. But the other side of that is that it's a really common investment. Landlords, by one measure, about 7% of all tax returns show rental income. A big chunk of the American populace puts their savings in rental housing, and that's really great. They don't have to trust it to a distant stock market or something else. They can invest in the house down the street or a few apartments with a few friends and rent it out and get a nice little nest egg for this house while providing housing for somebody else. And even beyond that, those big institutional investors, that's part of the stock portfolio and pension funds of all of our 401ks and our stock savings and so forth. It's not some distant people. We've met the enemy and it is us. This is all part, and we're railing against landlords. We're railing against our neighbors and our friends and even our own portfolios that we're all invested in. And if you expropriate them, you're going to get real housing complaint and justifiable housing complaint. I did a piece on with my friend Renu Mukherjee on the Asian American landlord movement that looked in New York at the large number of Asian American immigrants who put all of their savings into apartment buildings, and not an uncommon way for immigrants to invest. And they have been horrified, and to my mind, appropriately so, about the attempts by the city and the state to expropriate their life savings. Because this isn't like a stock market where, hey, AT&T goes down 20% and well, you have a million other stocks. You put all of your life savings into an apartment building and now it's worthless. My Lord, you have a very justifiable right to complain. And you've seen those Asian American landlord groups complain vociferously for this. So I don't think Mondami understands exactly the hornet's nest he's going to stir up when he tries to further squeeze these landlords. And Sia Weaver most certainly has no idea of all these working families who put their heart and soul into owning a tiny apartment building with the hope for a retirement, and now we'll see that dream destroyed.
Right. Right. I mean, there's thousands of landlords in New York City. I just quickly asked ChatGPT. They estimate there's about 250,000 landlords in the city.
This
It's
is
so
amazing.
interesting that people kind of imagine.
It's a city of less than 9 million people, and you have these hundreds of thousands of people who are renting out to other people, and yet they've been cast as the bad guys. These are the mixed up in everybody. Often these landlords are living in the same apartment as the people they're renting to. Like, this is just a good old fashioned American way to invest and earn, and the fact they've been painted as villains is just mystifying.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a couple Twitter accounts of people that are all anonymous, of course. And it's one guy, I think it's like Harlem tenant something. He has like 9 or 10 buildings in Harlem. He says that most of them now are underwater. Like, he's really got a problem on his hands. It's his life savings. He spent his entire life building a small portfolio of these small apartment buildings, and now they're not penciling. So I do think, if I were to give a prediction, I do think we're going to see a lot of bankruptcies in the next couple of years. And I think we're going to see a lot of these big, high scale, not developers, I guess, multifamily housing property managers come in and buy up a lot of the small buildings.
And I think we don't even know the full ramifications of this for the rest of the economy. So I'm not saying we're facing a 2008 financial crisis from this here, But we also already have New York Community Bank, which has said that it's in danger of going under, or at least it looks very much like it could go under, because it has a lot of mortgages in multifamily housing. We had, I believe it was the Signature Bank in New York that effectively went under back in 2023 because it was invested in a lot of these multifamily buildings. Now, again, it's all mixed up with all of this other stuff. It's not some distant group. A lot of people put their savings in New York Community Bank and in Signature Bank and others. And then we all have to pay for that if that goes under. You can't just squeeze these different parts of the capitalist economy and take all the rewards without expecting a lot of bad consequences down the road. And unfortunately, that looks like what New York might be facing.
Yeah, I find right now what's fascinating in New York specifically is 40% of the units are rent controlled. So there's this enormous voter block that relies on this system to live in New York. And it creates this voter block. Actually, Sia Weaver, Mamdani's tenant director, is very explicit about that in her interviews. She's saying, this is a voting block, and they're very incentivized to keep the system working in their favor, regardless of how it impacts the broader economy, the city, the growth of the city, other people that want to live in the city, et cetera. And it makes sense. I don't think anyone's evil in this scenario. That's what's so fascinating about housing to me is I used to live in a rent-controlled unit. I lived in it for years. I paid way under market, and I benefited from that. I was able to spend a lot of time outside of my rent-control apartment, my savings towards other things. I will say anecdotally, I know a lot of people with rent control. They have amazing travel budgets and properties elsewhere.
I benefited too. A lot
it's
of
very,
us have.
very common and very normal.
Yeah.
And I don't look at that as evil. I just look at it as, like we all benefit from the system in different ways. And so I view this as an example of where the system is inefficient. And it does have costs, but that are sort of externalized and that people don't really think about very much. I think, people say things like they want housing to be decommodified. They'll be like, I'll see these comments like, well, housing shouldn't be a business. They want the landlords to go out of business. Or like, it should go up for a fire sale. So then the people who live there can buy them. And I find that so fascinating because I'm thinking, not everyone can afford to buy. Not everyone has the financial setup to be able to get a mortgage, to put down payment, et cetera. So you have a lot of people that actually rely on renting to have housing. And so when people say things like, well, housing shouldn't be a business, everyone should just own their own home. It should, why should someone benefit from renting out a house? That really bothers me because what I think is there's so many people who rely on rental units to have a roof over their head. And it's sort of fantasy thinking that everyone on the planet can afford a mortgage or a down payment on a unit. And
we all make a choice to rent or to own. And a lot of financial economists, others would say, owning is actually a very risky thing, maybe even more risky than renting, because you yourself are putting all your investments in this one house that you can't move and it could burn down or do a million things could happen to it. But
so the decision to rent, I'm personally a big fan of rentals. I have been a renter my entire adult life. I've never owned property. I'm very hesitant to be a property owner. And actually, a lot of people are hesitant to be a property owner. There's a tremendous amount of responsibility. Something breaks, you don't have someone to call, unless if you have a plumber friend, which I luckily do. But there are so many benefits to being a renter. You can invest your capital otherwise, rather than putting so much of your net worth into property or real estate. There's a ton of people who rent their whole lives. There are a ton of economists who argue that renting is typically the smartest thing to do. You'd be better off investing your money outside of the housing market. I mean, we can see right now, I've been looking just for fun at housing values in New York City. They're basically the same as they were 10 years ago. So if you put all your money into a condo, you probably haven't really made anything on that money. Whereas if you put it in the markets, you would have maybe even doubled it. So I think there's a lot of benefits to renting, and all these laws are making renting harder. That's what I'm hearing. That's my key takeaway so far.
And you're right. There's a famous study, and this relates it directly to the rent control discussion. Rent control in World War II. And when did you see the greatest increase in home ownership in American history? And the answer is you saw it during the Second World War. You saw an unbelievable surge in homeownership, about a 10 percentage point change, about 45 to something like 55+% of people own their own homes. And for those people who believe in homeownership, and I certainly like it, there's good reason. There's lots of good reasons people want to own their own home, but they certainly shouldn't be forced to own their own home. I, like you, actually, until a year and a half ago, through my whole life renting, and was very happy to do it. There's a lot of advantage to it. I read a book on the mortgage market, for Lord's sake, and never had a mortgage in my life. Because renting allowed the flexibility and freedom to both invest and to change my mind about where I was living when I did, that homeownership didn't. What you see in cases like World War II and others is these rent control forced a lot of landlords to basically shut up shop and give or sell off to a lot of tenants their buildings. But then those tenants had to assume all of those risks, the danger of the value going down, the maintenance, all the rest of it, that they didn't want to before. And they didn't want to because they weren't buying before. That's a bad thing. You don't want to force people into owning homes that they can't and shouldn't afford, and by their own lights don't want. And a lot of the language today from Weaver and others about we're going to decommodify it or something. One, it's all commodified. Even if you own your own home or you're part of a co-op, it's part of the market. It doesn't immediately move to socialist Russia or something just because it turns into a co-op. They very much care about their co-op investment, just like anyone else. And also, like, it's going to be part of this general situation we're in, where people should be allowed to choose, as we discussed before, different property ownership functions for different parts of their life. They want to rent some point and they want to own some other point and they want to rent again later, and that's okay. But the Weavers, the Mondavis, the worlds don't understand that. They have a nice big ideology that's going to explain everything and shows why a lot of the choices people are making right now are wrong. And they're not wrong. In general, we want people to be able to make as many of these choices as they can under the maximum possibility for accommodating the housing for their own lives, which is very complex.
Right. Both of them have written extensively that the goal is public housing or social housing for everybody, or for whoever needs it or wants it. Are there any examples of public housing that you think are really positive around the world? From what I understand, Singapore has a huge stock of public housing. I'm just curious if there's any credence to what they're saying.
Well, so there's
Vienna, people talk about Vienna.
they read Vienna, and Singapore, Hong Kong has a lot of publicly owned housing, and New York is one of the more public housing markets in the world too. The short answer is no. I have nothing particularly good to say about
like 300,000 people.
Yeah, and
I
that's
was
not
just going to say,
including.
New York City public housing is big. There's something like 300,000 people in it.
Yeah, and that doesn't even count the people I think in the voucher program that are subsidized by the city and private units. So yeah, there's a book actually by this guy Nicholas Dagan Bloom about New York City public housing called Public Housing That Worked, and the title is actually very much an overstatement, because basically what he means is it never got to the point of, say, Chicago public housing, where people were hiding out on the floor of their buildings because they were worried about gunshots through windows at all times. And then again, so eventually they had to just bulldoze the whole lot of them. It basically meant the New York public housing was better maintained than some other public housing units, which is true. But still, by any measure, it froze a city in place. It didn't allow for changes in living situations, lifestyles. Just like you mentioned, the people in apartments that are in far too large apartments but won't move because they're rent controlled. You have a significant portion of elderly women in New York City public housing apartments with 3 bedrooms that obviously don't want to live in a 3-bedroom public housing unit, but that's where they've been stuck. And in general, yeah, just the government does not make a good landlord. If you want to help people, you should allow them to have more money in general, or maybe have more choices of housing units. But why on earth should the government be the one being the property manager? There's just no logic to show that they would be a better property manager. So I don't entirely understand where Mondami and Weaver are coming from on that front.
So it sounds like you're probably a bigger fan of vouchers.
Vouchers have their own
for people who are
problem.
low income?
Yeah, vouchers have their own problem, but they are superior. And the reason they became prominent starting in the 1970s, in 1974, when the what's known as Section 8 started, people were understandably frustrated at the terrible condition of public housing. And a lot of people pointed out, well, then just give the people money to live in private sector housing. And on the whole, that's been superior. Now, I think the voucher problem has an infinitude of its own uh, issues there, but largely it's better than having the government just run the housing itself.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. So just to wrap up, here's a fun question for you. Let's say you were the mayor of New York City. What would be your plan for the first 100 days in terms of housing? What would be your, top 3 wish list, and why?
Well, yeah, the short answer would be immediate vacancy decontrol, at the very least on rent controlled and rent stabilized housing, meaning we go back to the old situation where at the least after somebody leaves, you can raise the rent up to the market price again. That was something that was changed fairly recently in New York, and that was a devastating policy. Ideally, you basically get rid of most every one of the rent stabilized buildings, or allow the new buildings to increase their rent very rapidly. Move them out of the program, but at the very least, getting vacancy decontrol back in there, I think, would be a good thing. The second thing would be just upzone huge chunks of the city. Now, at the end of Mayor Adams' mayoralty, he helped pass the city of Yes, was very much a good thing, but just increase the amount of the city that can accommodate multifamily apartments and big new multifamily apartments. And then the third thing I would do, which is perhaps the least popular of all 3 of them, even though the first 2 might be particularly unpopular, is limit tenant protections in housing court. Now, this sounds very bad to a lot of people, but New York City has some of the most stringent tenancy protections anywhere, partially because they know landlords want to get rid of people in these rent stabilized apartments. And so they add all of these unfortunate tenant protections in there and make housing court very difficult for landlords to prevail in. But what that means is a lot of tenants effectively have a life estate in that housing unit, that they can stay there unless they murder someone in it or haven't paid their rent or years and so forth. And there's an abundance of economic evidence that excessive tenant protections lead to higher rental prices in general. Because again, the landlords need to make up for the costs they know they might face in the future if tenants won't leave, and actually more homelessness. There was a recent piece that showed areas with a lot more tenant protections, even though those tenancy protections were often proposed as a way to prevent people from being kicked out of the street, it actually led to more homelessness because you were less likely to service that lower end of the housing market, where people often do have to be evicted at times. So I would, rather unpopularly, make it a little easier for landlords to move people out who aren't paying the rent and who are destroying the property, which would allow more people to move into those properties that can afford them, allow landlords to keep their property in good order, and allow more turnover. But nobody's going to do that one anytime soon. So
Yeah.
we'll see.
Right. I read your piece on that. It was fascinating. I will link it in the show notes, basically showing the more tenant protections you put into the law, the higher the rent goes, which makes sense. And I've read quite a bit about how when there's all these tenant protections, landlords are hesitant often to rent to certain people and become extremely discriminatory.
Yeah, the lower
on
end
all
of the
kinds
market.
things,
Yeah.
like race, gender, age, etc.
Yeah, the lower end
In
of the
terms
market
of the
gets
tenant
hurt.
protections that you think are the most right. In terms of the tenant protections that you think are the most damaging, are there any that you would like to just mention so that people know what you mean when you say tenant protections? Maybe you could just give a few examples.
I'll be a little hesitant to go into specifics on this. I think just the general presumption in New York housing court that the tenant is right is one of the more dangerous ones. So a tenant can come up to a specialized New York housing court and plead his case about why he missed a rent check or why he was in the right to rip the toilet off the floor of the bathroom or whatever it is. And the housing court judge will say, yeah, you are in the right, go back in there. And the landlord has to accommodate your needs. I think that needs to change. And that's not like the clearest policy on earth, but it is something that the message has come down from the politicos on high that you should basically protect a tenant no matter what. And that presumption that the tenant is right, similar to the customer is always right, just needs to change. And that would take a lot of effort, but that is the standard in a lot of the rest of the country, that, or at least you have a more equal balance between tenants and landlords, which you just don't have in New York.
Got it. Yeah, those are tricky situations because they often involve really painful personal stories, right? Like mental illness or drug addiction, or there are these people losing a job, or I mean, I don't know. I haven't dug a ton into tenant protection laws, but I think there are definitely a lot of bad tenants out there, and no one talks about it really. Like there are tenants that are destructive and take advantage of their situation, and it makes sense that if you don't have a legal system that enables property owners to go through an eviction process, that it would drive up costs. It's very logical. So yes, I'm really a lot of these topics are very uncomfortable to discuss. They're so emotional. People feel, I think the thing that's particularly tricky about apartment rentals is people think, well, this is my home, and it is their home, but it's also owned by someone else, and that makes it more complex. It's not the same as when you own your own home, I think. So there's a lot of complexity. That's one of the reasons I find housing so fascinating, is it touches everything from like individual psychology, but also economics, policy, government, society, culture, and I think there's just a lot of what's the word? A lack of focus on downstream consequences of the policies or the long-term consequences of policies. There's a lot of short-term thinking in the world of housing. And I think what we've seen in the past is this can be extremely destructive in the long term, but politicians aren't necessarily incentivized to think about the long term. And therefore, we have a housing crisis.
Exactly. Couldn't put it better.
All right. Well, anything else you want to share before we wrap? I know we've covered a lot. Anything else top of mind?
No, there's much like you said, housing can be kind of a bottomless pit once you get into it. There's an infinite number of little things that you can start looking into once you're really curious. So yeah, no, just I'd encourage all people to look into it. It's a fascinating field. It does intersect with a lot of other things that everybody is interested in, and it's very much top of mind. I mean, I guess maybe the last thing I'll leave people with is that housing is a national political issue in a way that hasn't been really in America for 70 years. That if you look at the 2024 presidential election and congressional elections and all the rest of it, that the cost of living was obviously the number one issue to the American public, and nothing else actually came close. And when you drill down in what the cost of living issue was, they overwhelmingly meant the cost of housing. And I said in one of my pieces, the last time you saw housing be such a big issue in the national election was actually in the 1948, what they called the veterans election, when all the veterans were coming back from World War II and couldn't find housing, I would say partially because of the rent control we already discussed. But it became a national issue in that election in a way it hasn't really been for decades. So for people like me who care about housing policy, it's good to see increased interest in it. But I know that increased interest has come from the fact that housing policy has gone so horribly wrong that it's become a political topic just about up and down in every part of the American political system. So well worth learning more about and trying to fix.
All right, that is a wrap on this episode. You can find resources from this conversation, like books, articles, and more, down in the show notes. If something in this conversation made you think differently, or if you disagree, I'd love to hear from you. You can reach me at michelle@notesfromthefront.com. Thanks so much for listening, and hope to see you next time.